The whiskey glass slammed against the worn bar counter, sending amber droplets spiraling into the stale air of the Silver Dollar Saloon. Caleb Jenkins wiped his mouth with the back of his calloused hand, his once sharp blue eyes now clouded with the ghosts of memories he spent every night trying to drown. In Jordan Valley, Oregon, 1876, a man could lose himself if he tried hard enough, and Caleb had been trying for nearly 3 years. Another, he growled, sliding the empty glass toward the bartender, Sam, who had long since stopped trying to reason with him. "Ain't gonna bring them back, Caleb," Sam muttered, pouring another generous shot anyway. "No matter how deep you go into that bottle." Caleb didn't respond. He never did when folks mentioned the past. The entire town of Jordan Valley knew his story, or at least the parts he couldn't hide. Former U.S. Marshal who'd hung up his badge after losing his wife and young son to smallpox while he was away tracking a gang of bank robbers. The man who'd once upheld the law now seemed intent on drowning himself one drink at a time. The saloon doors swung open, bringing with them a gust of spring air that carried the scent of wildflowers and promised things Caleb had long since stopped believing in. He didn't bother turning around, even as the usual chorus of whispers and boot shuffling indicated a newcomer of interest. Jordan Valley didn't see many strangers, especially not ones that could silence a room of hardened ranchers and miners. "Excuse me," a woman's voice called out, clear and confident. "I'm looking for information about this area. Specifically, about a family that lived here some years back. The Nortons." The whiskey glass paused halfway to Caleb's lips. His shoulders tensed visibly beneath his worn leather vest. "What business you got with the Nortons, madam?" Sam asked, voicing the question that hung in the suddenly thick air. "My name is Margaret Nelson. I'm a journalist from San Francisco," she replied. "I'm writing about pioneering families across the Western Territories." Caleb finally turned, his movements slow and deliberate. The woman standing at the entrance was tall and slender, dressed in a practical traveling outfit nothing like the fancy Eastern ladies who occasionally passed through on their way to Portland or the working girls who frequented the saloon. She had auburn hair pulled back into a neat bun and intelligent green eyes that scanned the room, finally landing on him. For a moment, those eyes widened slightly with recognition. Or was that his imagination? "There ain't been Nortons in these parts for years now," Sam said, shaking his head. "Only one left is buried up on the hill. Rest moved on after the tragedy." Margaret Nelson nodded thoughtfully, still looking at Caleb. "And would anyone here know where the survivors went? I understand they had extended family." Several patrons returned to their drinks and card games, interest waning now that the newcomer's presence had been explained. But Caleb remained frozen, watching as the woman deliberately walked toward him. "You look like you could use some company, sir," she said, her voice lowered as she claimed the stool beside him. Up close, he could see the light dusting of freckles across her nose and the determination in her eyes. "What I look like is a man who wants to be left alone," Caleb replied gruffly, downing his whiskey in one swift motion. "Is that Caleb Jenkins I'm speaking with?" she asked softly, unperturbed by his rudeness. His head snapped up, eyes narrowing. "Who's asking?" "I told you. Margaret Nelson. I'm a writer." She removed her gloves carefully, laying them on the counter. "Though I may have misrepresented my purpose somewhat. I'm not just writing about any pioneering families." "Not interested in your book, Miss Nelson." She leaned closer. "I'm not writing a book about the Nortons, Mr. Jenkins. I'm writing about the men who brought justice to the Western Territories. Men like you." Caleb stood abruptly, tossing coins onto the bar. "You've wasted your journey, madam. That man doesn't exist anymore." Without waiting for her response, he strode toward the door, ignoring the curious glances from the other patrons. The evening air hit him hard after the warmth of the saloon, but he welcomed it, hoping it might clear the fog that had settled in his mind at the mention of his former life. "Mr. Jenkins," Margaret called, hurrying after him. "Please, just a moment of your time." He kept walking, boots kicking up dust on the main street of Jordan Valley as he headed toward his small cabin on the outskirts of town. "I knew her," Margaret called after him. "Eleanor Norton. I knew her before she married and moved west." Caleb froze mid-stride. Slowly, he turned back to face her, his expression guarded. "What did you say?" Margaret approached cautiously, like one might approach a wounded animal. "Eleanor was my cousin. We grew up together in Boston. The world seemed to shift beneath Caleb's feet. Eleanor Norton hadn't been his wife's name. His Sarah had been a Watson before they married. But Eleanor Norton had been the woman whose family he'd failed to protect when he was still wearing a badge. The woman whose husband and eldest daughter had been murdered by the Blackwell gang while he'd been pursuing a false lead miles away. If you knew Eleanor, he said carefully, then you know I'm the last person who should be in your book. Margaret shook her head. That's not true. Eleanor never blamed you. None of the family did. Caleb laughed bitterly. Then they're more forgiving than they ought to be. Now if you'll excuse me, she's alive, Mr. Jenkins. 3 words. 3 impossible words that stopped him more effectively than a bullet. What did you say? His voice was barely a whisper now. Abigail, Eleanor's youngest. She survived. Margaret's eyes glistened with unshed tears in the moonlight. Eleanor passed 2 years ago from consumption, but before she died, she made me promise to find you, to tell you that you weren't to blame. Caleb felt as though his legs might give out beneath him. That's not possible. I saw the homestead. There were no survivors. By the time you arrived, Eleanor had already fled with Abigail. They were hiding in a root cellar a quarter-mile from the house. They made it to Boise, then east to St. Louis, and finally back to Boston. The memories Caleb had spent years drowning in whiskey came flooding back with painful clarity. The Norton homestead burning against the night sky. The bodies of James Norton and his 14-year-old daughter Elizabeth. The tracks leading away from the house that he'd assumed belonged to the Blackwell gang. Why, he managed. Why now, after all these years? Margaret drew a deep breath. Because I promised Eleanor, and because I've spent the last year tracking down the men who brought justice to families like ours. Men who deserve to be remembered for the good they did, not just the tragedies they couldn't prevent. She reached into her bag and withdrew a sealed envelope. She wrote this for you before she died. She wanted you to know that your warning saved them. You rode through a snowstorm to tell them the Blackwell gang was headed their way. James insisted on standing his ground, but he made Eleanor take Abigail and run. Caleb stared at the envelope, unable to reach for it. And the girl? Abigail. She's 18 now, living with her aunt in Chicago. She remembers you, you know. Remembers the brave Marshal who used to bring her peppermint sticks when he came to check on the homesteaders. Something broke inside Caleb, then a dam he'd built around his heart to hold back the flood of guilt and grief. He turned away, not wanting this stranger to see the tears that threatened. Mr. Jenkins, Margaret said gently, I have a room at the boarding house. Perhaps we could continue this conversation tomorrow, when you've had time to process what I've told you. He nodded without turning back. Tomorrow, then. As Margaret's footsteps receded, Caleb looked up at the star-filled Oregon sky, feeling the weight of his ghosts pressing down on him. One family, he couldn't save his own. Another he thought he'd failed, only to discover he'd helped save 2 lives instead. For the first time in 3 years, he walked home without stopping to buy a bottle. Dawn broke over Jordan Valley, painting the eastern sky in hues of pink and gold. Caleb sat on the porch of his small cabin, turning the unopened letter over in his hands. He hadn't slept, the revelation from Margaret Nelson keeping his mind racing through the night. He'd read the letter a dozen times in his mind already, imagining Eleanor's forgiveness, her gratitude. But what if it contained accusation instead? What if her dying words were meant to ensure he never forgot his failure? The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew his attention. Margaret Nelson rode toward his cabin, sitting confidently atop a chestnut mare. She wore a simpler dress today, practical for riding, her auburn hair braided and draped over one shoulder. You're up early, he commented as she dismounted. I found that dawn is often the best time to understand a place, she replied, tethering her horse to the hitching post. And the best time to understand a person. Caleb gestured to the second chair on his porch. Coffee's hot inside if you want some. I'd appreciate that. When he returned with 2 steaming cups, he found her studying the letter in his hands. You haven't opened it, she observed. No, he admitted, handing her a cup. Some truths are harder to face than others. Margaret accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks. Eleanor wasn't one to hold grudges, Mr. Jenkins. She wouldn't have asked me to find you if all she wanted was to burden you with guilt. Caleb sipped his coffee, considering her words. You said you're writing about men who brought justice to the territories. I assume you've spoken to others like me. I have, she confirmed. Former lawmen, frontier judges, even a Pinkerton agent or two. Men who stood between civilization and chaos during the hardest years of Western expansion. And what have you found? Men at peace with their choices, or men like me? Margaret's green eyes studied him over the rim of her cup. I've found men who carried burdens too heavy for any one person to bear. Men who did what they thought was right, even when the cost was devastating. And you think these stories are worth telling? I do. She set her cup down and leaned forward. The West wasn't won by faceless heroes, Mr. Jenkins. It was shaped by flawed, human individuals who made difficult choices under impossible circumstances. Caleb considered her words, finding an unexpected clarity in them. You didn't just happen to find me, did you? You knew I was here. A small smile touched her lips. I've been tracking you for nearly 6 months. You left quite a trail from Colorado to here. Why go to such trouble for a washed-up lawman? Because your story didn't end with the Nortons, she said simply. Or with your family. You tracked the Blackwell gang for 8 months after that. You brought them to justice one by one. The memories surfaced like bubbles in a still pond. Pursuing Theodore Blackwell and his men across 4 territories. The methodical hunt that had consumed him after Sarah and their son Thomas had died while he was away. The cold satisfaction of seeing the last Blackwell brother swing from a gallows in Denver. That wasn't justice, Caleb said quietly. That was vengeance. Perhaps, Margaret conceded. But you stopped men who would have hurt countless other families. Eleanor knew that. It's why she never blamed you for what happened to James and Elizabeth. Caleb finally tore open the envelope, unfolding the delicate pages within. Eleanor's handwriting was shaky but legible, the words written in her final days. As he read, tears welled in his eyes. Not words of accusation, but of gratitude, of absolution. Eleanor thanking him for giving her the chance to save Abigail, for bringing the men who killed her husband and daughter to justice, allowing her to rebuild a life without looking over her shoulder. The final paragraph hit him hardest. I have often wondered what became of you, Marshal Jenkins. I pray you found peace after fulfilling your duty to us, and so many others. If not, please know that you are remembered with kindness by those of us you helped save. My Abigail still speaks of the kind Marshal with the blue eyes. Live well, Caleb Jenkins. You've earned that right. When he looked up, Margaret was watching him with gentle understanding. She never knew about Sarah and Thomas, did she? He asked. Margaret shook her head. No. By the time that happened, she was already back east. Caleb carefully refolded the letter. Thank you for bringing this to me. Will you tell me your story, Mr. Jenkins? The whole story? I believe it's one that deserves to be remembered correctly. He studied her face, the earnestness in her expression, the intelligence in her eyes. For the first time in years, he felt an urge to speak about the past rather than drown it. It's not a pretty tale, he warned. Few true ones are, she replied. Over the next 3 days, Caleb Jenkins told Margaret Nelson his story. They sat for hours on his porch, walked along the creek that ran behind his property, and occasionally rode into the foothills surrounding Jordan Valley. He spoke of his years as a marshal, of the families he'd protected and the outlaws he'd pursued. He told her about meeting Sarah in Denver, their whirlwind courtship, and the son who had his mother's gentle spirit. Margaret listened, asking questions that revealed her sharp intellect and genuine interest. She took notes in a small leather-bound journal, occasionally reading passages back to him to ensure she'd captured his words accurately. On the 4th day, as they sat beside the creek watching the sunset paint the water gold, Caleb realized he'd stopped reaching for the phantom whiskey bottle that had been his constant companion. The weight he'd carried for so long hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted, becoming somehow more bearable. You're good at this, he commented as Margaret closed her journal. Making a man remember things he spent years trying to forget. She smiled. Is that such a bad thing? The remembering. I'm still deciding, he admitted. But I'm grateful for Eleanor's letter. For knowing that at least in that case, I didn't fail completely. You didn't fail your family either, Caleb, Margaret said softly, using his first name for the first time. Smallpox would have taken them whether you were there or not. Perhaps more cruelly if you'd had to watch, helpless. He considered this perspective one he'd never allowed himself before. Maybe, but I should have been there. To do what? Die alongside them? What purpose would that have served? Her directness startled a laugh from him. You don't mince words, do you? Not when they need saying plainly. She brushed a strand of hair from her face. In my research, I found that guilt is the heaviest burden any lawman carries. Heavier than the badge, heavier than the gun. And what's your solution for that, Miss Nelson? Margaret, she corrected. And I don't presume to have solutions. Only questions that might lead men to find their own answers. As twilight deepened around them, Caleb found himself studying her profile against the darkening sky. There was something compelling about her, not just her beauty, which was considerable, but the fierce intelligence and compassion that radiated from her. How long will you stay in Jordan Valley? He asked, surprised by how much the answer suddenly mattered to him. I'd planned to leave at the end of the week, she replied. I have interviews scheduled in Boise next month. Disappointment settled in his chest. That's not much time to write a complete story. Margaret turned to face him, her expression thoughtful. No, it isn't. But perhaps the story isn't complete yet. Something in her tone made his heart beat faster. What do you mean? I mean that endings are tricky things, Caleb Jenkins. Sometimes what seems like an ending is merely a pause before the story continues in a different direction. Their eyes held for a long moment, the air between them charged with possibility. Then Margaret stood, brushing grass from her skirt. It's getting late. We should head back before we lose the light completely. As they walked side by side toward his cabin, Caleb felt something stirring inside him that he'd thought long dead hope. The following days fell into a pattern. Mornings were spent with Caleb showing Margaret around Jordan Valley and the surrounding countryside. He introduced her to the people he'd lived alongside for 3 years, but had kept at arm's length: ranchers, shopkeepers, and the few remaining settlers who'd staked their claims in the fertile valley. To his surprise, they knew more about him than he'd realized. Mrs. Peterson at the general store mentioned how he'd silently left medicine on her porch when her children had fallen ill last winter. Old Jim at the livery stable recounted how Caleb had helped rebuild his barn after a fire, working through the night without a word. You've made more of a mark here than you realize, Margaret observed as they rode back to his cabin after visiting a nearby ranch. They respect you. Tolerance isn't the same as respect, Caleb replied, though her words had stirred something in him. In the afternoons, they continued their interviews. Caleb found himself revealing things he'd never spoken aloud, not just about his time as a marshal, but about the grief that had nearly destroyed him and the guilt he'd used whiskey to numb. Margaret never judged, never offered empty platitudes. She simply listened, occasionally asking questions that helped him see his past from new angles. By the end of each session, he felt lighter, as though speaking the words had diminished their power over him. Evenings were spent on his porch, watching the stars emerge while sharing stories of their lives before they'd met. He learned that Margaret had defied her family's expectations by becoming a journalist instead of marrying a Boston businessman, that she'd traveled alone across the country, facing skepticism and danger with equal determination. Why risk so much? He asked one evening as they shared a simple meal of rabbit stew. Surely there were safer ways to make your mark on the world. Margaret considered the question carefully. I suppose I believe that some truths were worth the risk, that some stories needed telling, even if the journey to find them wasn't easy. And my story? Is it worth the months you've spent tracking me down? She held his gaze steadily. I believe it is. But more importantly, I think you needed to tell it. Maybe not for my book, but for yourself. The perceptiveness of her observation struck him silent. He realized with sudden clarity that the nightmares that had plagued him for years had receded since he'd started speaking about his past. The compulsion to drink himself into oblivion each night had faded. You've changed things, he admitted quietly. Being here, asking your questions. Margaret smiled, the moonlight casting her features in silver. You've been changing things yourself, Caleb. I've just been here to witness it. 2 days before Margaret was scheduled to leave for Boise, Caleb took her to his special place, a hidden meadow high in the foothills where wildflowers grew in profusion and a natural spring bubbled up through limestone rocks. It's beautiful, Margaret breathed, turning in a slow circle to take in the vista. How did you find it? I came up here to end things, about a year after I arrived in Jordan Valley, he admitted, the confession easier than he would have expected. Had my pistol and a bottle of whiskey. Thought I'd drink myself brave enough to use the gun. Margaret's face softened with compassion, but she didn't interrupt. Instead, I fell asleep drunk, and when I woke up, There were deer grazing not 10 feet from me. A fawn was so curious it nearly touched my face before its mother called it away. He smiled at the memory. Seemed like a sign that maybe I wasn't quite ready to check out. I've been coming here ever since, whenever things get too heavy. They spread a blanket beside the spring and shared the lunch. Margaret had packed bread, cheese, and dried apples. The conversation flowed easily between them, punctuated by comfortable silences. Will you continue drinking when I leave? Margaret asked suddenly, her direct manner catching him off guard. Caleb considered the question honestly. I don't think so. Doesn't seem to serve a purpose anymore. And what will you do instead? Will you stay in Jordan Valley? I haven't thought that far ahead, he admitted. For 3 years, getting through each day was challenge enough. Margaret set aside her food and turned to face him directly. Caleb, there's something I haven't told you. A knot formed in his stomach. What's that? I haven't been entirely honest about my book. She drew a deep breath. The publisher in San Francisco has already seen the first few chapters. They want the complete manuscript by Christmas, and they want me to accompany it for a publicity tour. That's good news, isn't it? He asked, confused by her serious expression. It is. But it means I'll be traveling extensively next year. Boston, New York, Chicago, Denver. Understanding dawned. You're worried about finishing the book in time. No, she said softly. I'm worried about leaving you behind. The simple admission hung in the air between them, fraught with meaning. Caleb's heart hammered in his chest as he processed her words. Margaret, please let me finish, she interrupted gently. I came to Jordan Valley looking for a story, but I found something I wasn't expecting. Someone I wasn't expecting. She reached out tentatively, placing her hand over his. These past 2 weeks, watching you reconnect with your past, seeing you engage with life again. It's affected me, more than it should have, professionally speaking. Caleb turned his hand to clasp hers, marveling at how right it felt. I think we've moved beyond professional some time ago, haven't we? A smile bloomed across her face. I believe we have. The question is, what do we do about it? I have obligations in San Francisco, and you have nothing holding me here, he finished. Except memories. Some worth keeping, others best left behind. Hope flickered in her eyes. What are you saying, Caleb? I'm saying that maybe it's time for a new chapter. One that doesn't involve drowning the past, but building something new instead. He squeezed her hand. If that's something you might consider. Margaret's free hand came up to rest against his cheek. I'd consider it very carefully, Marshal Jenkins. When their lips met, it felt like awakening from a long, dark sleep. Gentle at first, then deepening with shared emotion and newfound hope. Caleb pulled back first, resting his forehead against hers. I'm not the man I was, he warned. Not the Marshal you came looking for. No, she agreed, her fingers tracing the lines of his face. You're better. You're real. You faced your demons instead of just hunting everyone else's. They stayed in the meadow until sunset, making plans and sharing dreams that neither had dared to voice before. As they rode back toward town in the gathering dusk, Caleb felt the weight of the past finally beginning to lift. 2 days later, they stood on the platform of Jordan Valley's small railway station. Margaret's trunks were loaded, her ticket to Boise in hand. But instead of goodbye, they spoke of reunion. 1 month, she promised. I'll finish my interviews in Boise and meet you in San Francisco. Caleb nodded, still scarcely believing the turn his life had taken. I'll wire ahead about that carpentry job your friend mentioned. Should give me time to find us suitable lodgings before you arrive. Are you certain about this? She asked, searching his face. Leaving Jordan Valley, starting over? I've been hiding here, he replied honestly. It's time to step back into the world. Besides, he added with a smile, I have a vested interest in making sure my story gets told correctly. The train whistle blew, signaling the final boarding call. Margaret rose on her tiptoes and pressed a lingering kiss to his lips, oblivious to the curious stares of other passengers. Until San Francisco, she whispered. Until then, he agreed, helping her board. As the train pulled away from the station, Caleb Jenkins stood tall, watching until it disappeared around the bend. For the first time in years, he looked toward the future instead of drowning in the past. He walked back to the saloon one last time, nodding to Sam as he entered. Usual? The bartender asked, reaching for the whiskey bottle. No, Caleb replied, placing a sealed envelope on the bar. Just came to settle my tab before I leave town. Sam's eyebrows shot up. Leave town? Since when? Since I remembered there's more to life than what I've been doing here. Caleb placed a gold coin beside the envelope. This should cover what I owe, with something extra for your patience over the years. It's that writer woman, isn't it? Sam asked, a knowing smile spreading across his weathered face. She remembered who you used to be. Caleb considered this, then shook his head. No, she saw who I could be. That's worth a whole lot more. 3 weeks later, Caleb stepped off the ferry onto the bustling docks of San Francisco. The city sprawled before him, a maze of opportunity and new beginnings. In his pocket was Margaret's latest letter, containing the address of the small publishing house that had hired him as their in-house carpenter, a position created specifically to give him steady work while Margaret finished her book. As he made his way through the crowded streets, Caleb felt none of the anxiety he'd expected. Instead, each step seemed to carry him further from the man who had sought oblivion at the bottom of a whiskey glass and closer to the man Margaret Nelson had helped him rediscover. When he finally reached the modest offices of Westward Publishing, she was waiting on the steps, her face lighting up as she spotted him through the crowd. He quickened his pace, drawn to her like a compass finding true north. "Welcome home," Margaret said as he reached her, taking both his hands in hers. And for the first time in years, Caleb Jenkins truly believed he was.